guess that we'll talk about over the next 4 weeks. It's going to be kind of an unfolded conversation. Is that from my perspective, at least, addiction is really rooted in disconnection, and that really is the thing that fuels addiction more than anything else is the experience of loss of connection, the experience of not being connected. And if anything has come out of the pandemic environment, right? The ethos that's been kind of created in the environment in the pandemic is definitely a loss of connection, right? We've all dealt with isolation. Isolation drives addiction more than anything else. And so, I did an online summit last year as well on kind of holistic approaches to recovery. Recovery is not a one-stop shop in any way, shape, or form. There's refuge recovery, which is Buddhist driven. There's traditional 12-step. There's Nikki Myers has a yoga kind of recovery approach, and so I'm a strong believer that it's not so much we all recover in different ways, and we all have things that fuel these things. So I think that what you've put together here, Jan, is really amazing, and it really is these types of conversations that really do change things. I'm an integrative nutritionist and a holistic health coach, and I am deeply committed in transforming the global conversation around addiction. I feel very strongly that addiction is a word that it's kind of shrouded in stigma, and that's something that I really I've been on a mission to kind of shine a light on. What are the cultural appropriations of addiction? What are the interpretations that are out there that really are part of the thing that gets in the way of recovery for people? Anytime you have a sort of a linguistic moniker like addiction that's shrouded in guilt and shame, and this idea that there's something wrong with someone, it's gonna impede the path to healing and to recovery. And so that's that's one of the commitments that I have as a human being, is actually to impact that conversation and to just keep having the conversation and shedding light on it as much as I can. So I'm the founder of a company called Rising Phoenix Wellness, and my health coaching practice and everything I do really arises out of this deep held belief that through crisis, through trauma, through very, very challenging times in our life lies the opportunity for transformation. It's the phoenix is a bird that rises from the ashes, right? And so something beautiful and transformative is always possible out of really unsettling times, trying times, challenging times, even total breakdown. I had a time in my life that was really unpleasant, at that time, and even to think about these today, the kind of pain and suffering that is part of the addiction process is something that is very, very difficult to deal with. But over the next 4 weeks, what I will be unpacking is my experience. So I just want to say, right out of the gate, I am not a psychologist. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not, even an addiction therapist. I am, someone who has been in long-term recovery, dealt with drugs and alcohol addiction for 15 years in my life, and used different modalities to heal. And so that's the path that I've been on for myself personally, is using the things that have worked for me and help other people achieve that for themselves. So that's a little bit about me. The way that the way that I hope that the conversation will go today is, I will share a couple of slides in the beginning. I'm gonna share a short video from a kind of virtual mentor of mine named Gabor Mate, who is one of the world leaders in addiction addiction recovery. One of the first books that I read when I was in my recovery process was a book called In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, and he had a really profound impact on me. And his model for how to approach the conversation about what addiction is something that I really. I don't agree 100% with everything that Gabor says, but his starting point is really a place that I take off from. So that's the way that the conversation will go. I'll share a couple of slides, kind of introduce the One Tree community, introduce what I'm going to be unpacking over the next 4 weeks. And then we're going to watch a very short video from Gabor, and then essentially I'm just going to facilitate a conversation. So today is not, it's not going to be a quote-unquote presentation, if you will. It really is a dialogue, a conversation. And so, I encourage everybody to ask any questions that you have. You can put them in the chat box, and, that will be probably the best way as we move forward is, have people ask questions, share any concerns, any different perspectives that you have. All of that is welcome here. I don't claim to know the truth. What I know is, my own recovery path and what has worked for me. And so, yeah, so that's how the day, the conversation will unfold this week. And then we'll see how we go. So I will start by sharing a few slides. All right, you can see these, Jan? Okay, good. You can just do thumbs up. Awesome. So welcome everybody again to this series. It's called Addiction Recovery: The Path to Authentic Living. And that is really going to be the focus. So I know that people are here from different parts of the world. I know Chenga is here from Sri Lanka, a number of people from India. We have somebody from Indonesia. And so if you guys want to put in the chat box, if you're new to the conversation, please share with us where you're coming from. And if you want to, share why you are here today. What is it that made you interested in this conversation? And what are you curious to hear? Is there anything that you want to learn or anything that you want to take away from the session today? Feel free to share any of that stuff in the chat box, as it will inform the conversation as we go along. And it's also good to just get to know people a little bit. So the next thing I want to just share a little bit about the One Tree community and what Jan has put together here. Jan, you don't see it. There's no gray box on the side of the screen, is there? You just see the logo?
No, I am seeing that gray box. I don't think we can move that out of the way.
Okay. I'm going to have to stop and share again. All right, so share. Okay, usually the strategy that I use to have the gray box go away is not there. So what I will do is I will minimize this thing. Okay, is that better?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay, so the impact of this setup is that I won't be able to see the cameras, but I don't think people have their cameras on anyway. So So yeah, welcome to the One Tree community. So we really are, it's a new kind of budding community, and we are a group of spiritual practitioners, wellness practitioners, health practitioners from lots of different tradition, lots of different approaches, and our goal and mission is really to bring interdisciplinary conversations to the world, conversations that make a difference for people, and everything will be kind of in the health, the healing, the wellness space. And the idea is, that wellness, if you think about wellness, if you think about well-being, let's put it that way, as a tree, it has many branches, right? There's different approaches, there's different perspectives. But at the end of the day, humanity, if you think of humanity as a tree as well that has many branches, we're all on one tree, right? So there is no, we're all in this together. And so the gift that life has brought us has a lot of different perspectives. And so the One Tree community is really a conversation. It's really a conversation, let's put it that way. And we're all in the same conversation called, how we can live life the most aware that we can, in the best state of health and wellness that we can. And we're all in this thing together. So the more kind of reflections back that we get from the different perspectives that people have, the more that it can inform a life well lived. So that's part of the One Tree community. Like I said, my name is Nathan McCullough. I'm an integrative nutritionist, holistic health coach, and I'm deeply committed to working with people who are either have been in recovery or are actively in the recovery process. I'm in long-term recovery from drugs and alcohol myself, and I believe that the starting point, like today we're going to be talking about redefining addiction, because I think one of the things that gets in the way of addiction, I know that it did for me, is actually the way that we define it, the way that we view it, the way that we talk about addiction, right? Language has the power to create, and the way that we communicate about things and about people really it has the power to create, right? So the conversation around addiction is one of the things that I think gets in the way of the process of recovery more than anything else. My personal perspective is that addiction is a spectrum. It's not, it's not the guy under the bridge. We'll talk about this as we go along. But addiction is something that it touches all of us. And I believe that we all kind of fall on the spectrum somewhere, right? And I also believe that addiction is not a problem that needs to be solved. I believe very strongly that addiction is something that serves a purpose in our lives, right? It may not be the most healthy one, but it does serve a purpose, and it fulfills a need that we all have. And that's what I'm interested in, is finding out what is the need and the purpose that addiction serves, so that we can dissolve that and help people heal. Right? So addiction is a strategy. It serves a purpose, but it also covers up pain. And as that pain becomes revealed, there is an ocean of both suffering and healing that becomes possible. And over the next 4 weeks, my intention is to kind of wade into these waters and go on a journey that can help people become more aware of what the recovery process is. Because if you are here and you're in recovery, right, especially if you're in early recovery, as you go into this process, you're going to face some deep insecurities. You're going to face fears. You're going to face emotional trauma that has probably never been dealt with before, right? People that are in early recovery, one of the things you find right away is that in the addiction process, you become emotionally immature, right? There are emotions that have never been fully dealt with. And as you begin to go along the path of recovery, this deep emotional experience becomes revealed, and there's something that you have to come face to face with. However, I do believe that there is something uniquely powerful that becomes available to someone that is in the recovery process, and that is, you do have to deal with a lot of fear that people don't necessarily ordinarily have to deal with. So there is a particular spiritual awareness or spiritual awakening or transcendence that I think becomes possible for people that are in recovery that may not be possible for people that have never really dealt with addiction or recovery and had to go to kind of those depths. And that's what I going to be talking about over the next 4 weeks. Is essentially, today we're going to be talking about redefining what addiction is. Next week we're going to go into the past, right? And how, in my particular approach to recovery, it really is reckoning with our past that makes available acceptance and surrender and ultimately acceptance of who we are And it allows for us to complete the past. It allows us to not be beholden to or living in reaction to the things that we've done in our life in a way that creates freedom. And that allows for what we'll talk about in week 3, which is really unfolding and the creation of a new future, right? Standing in a new possibility, in a new paradigm of what it means to be a human being, and really, kind of like from a blank canvas, be able to really design and create your own future from a place of not from the past, but from an openness into the future. And then inside of that canvas that you're painting on, called your life, from that new place, comes the ability to create what Aristotle called thousands of years ago, right? One of the first early modern, one of the first Western philosophers, human flourishing. And for those of you who know me, for those of you who don't, I actually have a master's degree in philosophy. So in a former life, that was one of my main passions in life, was philosophy. And I studied a particular kind of philosophy called phenomenology. And I focused a lot on what they call ontology. So phenomenology is the study of human experience, lived human experience. Ontology of this is the study of being. And so you'll hear, as this conversation unfolds, I'll unpack what those things mean. But that comes from my training in philosophy. But Aristotle had this idea of flourishing as a human. And what that means is, the ability to live life unconstrained. And I believe very powerfully that what happens is when you have freedom and you can create a future, you can also build a community around that. And so in a lot of ways, one of the things that I'm very passionate about, and what I've been wanting to create in my life, is a community about human flourishing and about healing and about living an authentic life. And I think, Jan, what you've kind of stumbled into here, or created on purpose, I shouldn't say stumbled into, is really in some sense that, right? It's a community that is really designed around human flourishing. And so that's really the path over the next couple of weeks. It's going to be discovering a path to authentic living, right? So that's really the goal, and a roadmap kind of where we're going. Okay, so I made this slide, so you don't have to come on camera, okay? This is just kind of how to participate. If you want to come on camera and be with me in the conversation, I welcome that. If you don't want to come on camera, that's also okay. I understand everybody's in different places of the world, different times. You might be doing different things. But I do really request that you do engage as much as you can, right? In the chat box, share questions, share your, perspective, share your intentions, things like that, really engage in the conversation. Because it's not going to be scripted, okay? So I'm going to be kind of just sharing from the heart and hoping that we can collaborate in this conversation. All right, so like I said, the first thing I want to do is play a video from Gabor Mate that will kind of give us an idea of where my perspective comes from, right? The context in which it arises. And Jan, please let me know if the audio and video comes through as well, or if you can't hear it.
Addiction is not a choice that anybody makes. It's not a moral failure. It's not an ethical lapse. It's not a weakness of character. It's not a failure of will. It's just how our society depicts addiction. Nor is it an inherited brain disease, which is how the medical tendency is to see it. What it actually is, it's a response to human suffering. All addictions are a response to suffering, and that what people need in response to addiction is not judgment and not simply symptom control. They need to be helped to heal from their trauma, because it is all about trauma. The media, the television, cultural depiction of addicts is usually as desperate people, but without showing why they're desperate. So all that shows is the desperation for the drugs. There's no indication of what's driving that desperation. And hence you see them behaving in all kinds of dysfunctional ways, aggressive or manipulative or unpleasant. But again, there's no three-dimensional sense of the reality of these people as to what that's really all about for them. Is it possible to cure people? You're speaking from the Western model, where I am the expert and you're the one with the disease, and I'm going to cure you like you cure a piece of meat. No. The answer to that question, framed that way, is no, it's not possible. If you're asking, is it possible for people to heal from trauma sufficiently that they don't have to keep escaping into addictions to lessen the suffering of their trauma? Yes, that's entirely possible. Why don't they listen? Why don't they get better already? Why don't they give it up? Well, they don't give it up because the more hurt they are, the more they need to escape. In other words, the addiction wasn't your problem. Your problem was that you had a lot of emotional pain, you didn't know what to do with. So the addiction was really an attempt to solve a problem. So when you say, why do people use substances or why do they engage in addictions in general, it's because they have a problem they don't know what to do with. And if you really understand their addiction, we have to ask, well, what gave you so much emotional pain? And how come you didn't have the internal resources? This is not a judgment, it's simply an inquiry. How come you lacked at some point the internal resources to deal with that pain in a more creative, forward-looking way that would help you resolve the pain rather than to perpetuate it? So really what it was is that the addiction came along to help you solve a problem you had no other solutions for at the time. And that's the case for all addictions. So why do people use? Why do people engage in addictions? Because they have deep emotional problems they don't have the means to resolve on their own. That's why they use. Psychiatrists these days are trained mostly in this biological model of psychiatry where everything comes down to a biological brain disease. Here, let's give you a pill. The last thing most psychiatrists know how to talk about is actually emotional pain or its origins in human experience. You think they know how to do that, but they don't. They're not trained in it. It's not part of the predominant medical ideology. And, as a physician, I can tell you, we like to think of medicals as a science, and it has certainly great scientific achievements to its credit and great scientific insights to buttress its successes. But it's as much as ideology as a science. And ideology has certain hidden assumptions that are hidden from the people that believe in ideology. And so that if something is excluded by your ideology, you just won't see it. And so that you can be talking to somebody about your addiction, and the simple question, what did they do for you? And how come you're in so much emotional pain? Doesn't occur to anybody, trained in a classical manner. No, this is true not just for physicians, it's true for a lot of psychologists as well, who are more interested in solving your problems and getting you to overcome the behavior than in asking, well, okay, where does behavior come from? And what are you still carrying inside that's making you behave that way? And how can we help you resolve what's inside you? Not just how do we help you change your behavior, but how do we help you change? Now that's what healing is. And that happens inside a person. So it's never a question of anybody curing anybody else, but we can guide people to healing if we ask the right questions.
Okay. Hey, I can see you, Jenga. All right, so that's like I said, that is Gabor Mate. That's one of my sort of virtual mentors and someone who's been deeply influential in the perspective that I have about addiction and what it is. But ultimately, even for those of you who are maybe on this call and you don't have, you're not actively dealing with addiction, never dealt with it in your life, my perspective is that it's not even about addiction, okay? So this talk is actually not about addiction. It's about healing. And one thing I know about being human is that we all suffer. We all have things that are unresolved in our lives, whether it's with our parents or things that have happened to us when we're young. And it just so happens that people that have addictions are people that felt the same feelings and chose to engage in a particular behavior that had them not feel that way for a particular time being, and then they got sort of ensnared in a particular behavior pattern that has them end up wherever they end up. And whether you're someone that deals with addiction or not, healing is something that we all need, right? The path towards spiritual awakening is actually part of the same process, right? It's dealing with the deep sort of emotional pain and the suffering that is part of being human, right? The Buddha talked about human living as sort of as suffering, right? It's a given, and this is going to be kind of how to deal with that aspect of our humanity, and create something beautiful out of it. Okay, so that's kind of the general idea of the talk, but I'm going to be talking about it through the lens of addiction, because it kind of takes the thing that's in all of us and makes it the most visible that we can talk about. Here's a model for healing, and then we can use addiction as a way of dealing with that. So I just want to unpack some of the things that Gabor said that I think are extremely important. And that is the common kind of misconception, or the kind of interpretation around addiction that needs to be sort of getting out of the way right off the bat. And that is, Gabor said that addiction is not a choice. It's not a moral failure. It's not a character defect. It's not a lack of willpower. And ultimately, it's not sort of on the other spectrum. It's not a brain disease or a particular kind of disease thought of in the kind of the Western medical model as something that needs to be cured. Okay? Now, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with right off the bat. I just want to say I'm not opposed to the Western medical tradition. I'm not opposed to treatments when it comes to addiction as well. There's always a place for medicine, for interventions and things like that. But ultimately, they don't reach the full understanding of what people are dealing with until you can get down inside of people's human experience and deal with what's at the root cause, right? In functional medicine, you're dealing with root causes and not symptoms, right? So we're going to take kind of a functional approach to addiction and help people understand that addiction is a symptom. The behaviors are a symptom. And if you're just dealing with the behaviors, you're never actually going to get to the healing that's required to have someone be free. So that's kind of, those are some of the common understandings of what, quote unquote, addiction means. And we'll get a little bit into why I think that is the case. I feel like if people do cast addiction in that light, it's easy to dissociate from that rather than actually look and see. I think if people really understood what was at the root of addiction, they'd find uncomfortably probably that some of the way that they live their life and some of their internal mechanisms are much closer to that than maybe one wants to really deal with. But I really do believe if you're going to deal powerfully with addiction, that is a conversation that needs to be had, and it's an understanding that you may not be so far away from what you think of as someone who has addiction as you may think, and that allows for if you watch the talk a couple earlier in the week from Chris, one of the beautiful things in a lot of the Eastern tradition is this focus on loving kindness and this focus on compassion, and ultimately what I think a proper understanding of addiction allows for is an understanding that you're not so far away from the depravity that that a lot of addiction is cast in, and that allows for a particular kind of compassion and a particular kind of more loving approach. And ultimately, I believe very strongly that love and compassion are the things that actually dissolve the addiction as well. So that's part of the process. When we think about addiction in this way, like as Gabor said as well, one of the main things that is really powerful inside of what he said is that when you do begin to redefine addiction in this light, it opens up an understanding of addiction as a response. It's kind of an adaptive response to human suffering. And when it's thought of in that way, then what's needed is healing, as we've said, right? It's not a cure. A cure presupposes that there's something wrong. There's a pathology happening. And what we're talking about is healing, which is a kind of non-judgmental process of not asking the question what's wrong, but asking the question what happened. And that allows to get to the source of the pain. And ultimately, the story about what happened. Okay, so I'll unpack this in deeper next week. One of the main focuses will be how, as human beings, we don't actually deal with what happened to us in our life. What we do is we kind of create a story or interpretation around what has happened to us, and then that's what we live inside of, is the story or the trauma. The trauma is not actually what happened. The trauma is the emotional interpretation that sort of envelops the things that have happened to us in life. And that's really, in my opinion, where the work happens, is actually dismantling and dissolving and helping get rid of the trauma, so that you can actually dissolve that, right? Get rid of it. Versus a kind of symptoms or behavioral approach to addiction, which focuses on either reducing it to brain chemistry or just thinking about addiction as a set of behaviors that people have, like that. So I hope that makes sense. So does anybody have any questions or anything about that so far? Otherwise, I'll just keep talking. She's a mindful recovery. Mel is a mindful recovery coach and training under Gabor Mate. Wow. Amazing. Okay, so Mel, I hope that you'll come back in the following weeks, because Gabor has a particular interpretation around trauma, and at the end of this talk, I'll kind of reveal to you guys my sort of phenomenological, ontological approach, and how, in a lot of ways, what happens is addiction becomes an identity. It becomes who we are. We start viewing ourselves through the lens of addiction. So much so that we think that we are our addiction, right? And this becomes the story inside of which we live our lives, and it becomes kind of an inescapable reality. And like Anastalisa, she just asked, "How do you heal this trauma?" Right? And so when you understand addiction in this way, you'll start. What we'll start revealing is that the way that you heal this is to understand that you have an addiction. It's not who you are. It's not an identity. And we, as human beings, we live inside of identities, interpretations of who we are, right? We think that we know who we are, when reality, this story, this conversation that we have about who we are is something that's woven out of the different experiences that we've had in life. And in reality, different things could have happened to you, and you could have a completely different story about who you are. So there's no fixed way of being that you have or that you are, right? You are a fluid kind of interpretation. So that's really where a lot of this work gets to, is helping people understand that, they are not their addiction. And if you don't have addiction, here's what I have to say to you. You are not the story that you have about who you are, right? You're not the things that you've dealt with. You're not the pain that you feel. You're not the anxiety that you experience as a human being, right? These are things that you have. They're not things that you are. And it really is this level of identity level work that allows for freedom. So thanks for that question, right? When you guys ask me those questions, it's helpful, right? Because it helps me kind of interact with where you're at as well. Okay, so the next thing I want to kind of touch on is with this definition of addiction, right? Thought of on the way far end of the spectrum. Right. So if you say, for example, addiction can be, we use food to deal with our emotions, right? Or we use pornography to deal with boredom, or we deal with alcohol to deal with pains in our, struggles in our relationship, or we use alcohol to celebrate. These are kind of on a spectrum. That's how I think about it. And part of the reason why, in the cultural narrative, right, if you look in movies, television shows, magazines, like addiction has been cast in this light where it's the guy under the bridge with the paper bag, or with the needle hanging out of its arm, or it's the people in the crack house. And it's like it's so far on the wide endrum of the spectrum that it becomes very, very difficult for your average, your quote unquote average functional person to identify with that. And so they don't actually get access to being able to deal with the fact that they have a particular behavioral pattern that shows up in their life that is unwanted. And so Gabor actually defines addiction as a set of behaviors that you engage with in your life despite negative consequences. And it's a very simple definition, but I like the definition because it's more inclusive, right? I think everybody on this call can locate themselves in that definition. And so I really believe in a lot of ways that the cultural narrative that depicts addicts as vagrants and despots and people that are outcasts, part of the impact of that is that it doesn't allow other people to really deal with what's going on with them because they don't want to be associated. Oh, I'm not like that. I'm not one of those people. And in my own journey, I started drinking alcohol heavily. The first time that I drank it was a friend of mine in our bathroom when I was 14 or 15 years old. And we got one of these little funnels, these little beer bong things. And we drank 30 beers in a couple of hours. And most of that was me. My friend was, sick very quickly. And I also got sick quickly, but it didn't stop what I was doing. And so, from the very first time that I drank, it was like there was some dysfunction there. I didn't understand that because I was a 15-year-old kid. But something that I did for, in a lot of ways, fun, ultimately turned dark after a while, But this is one of the things that I think people don't talk about enough is oftentimes, it's not just dealing with pain and suffering. There are some pleasant things that come from the substances that we use. And I think it's also important to understand that it's not all black and white, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It's not all everybody that's on this end of the spectrum. If you think about addiction as any behavior that you engage in and you continue to engage in it despite unwanted negative consequences, it gives a much more accessible idea about what addiction is. And also the depiction of addicts in this sort of as desperate vagrants, outcasts, like Gabor was saying in the video, it also doesn't focus on the holistic experience of that human being, right? The context in which their behavior is embedded in. And so when you have a kind of behavior modification treatment, or a simply like a medical reductionist disease model, these don't allow for the understanding of human experience that is really required in the healing process. And that's why the limitations of the Western model are there, in my opinion, because inside of the behavior modification or the disease model, all there really is are quote unquote treatments, seeking a cure, pills, things like that. It's the same thing with mental health, right? A lot of the mental health that people deal with these days as an illness is treated simply with antidepressants or anxiety medications and things like that. And without the deeper work to figure out what's actually driving these things, the healing that's required is missing. And so that's where the phenomenology comes in, okay? So the phenomenology is the study of first-person lived human experience from the inside. So the intention of the phenomenological method is the difficult task, but it's the task of actually putting yourself inside of the experience itself and looking for ways to heal and looking for approaches to healing from inside of the experience, not standing outside of it from an objective third-person perspective. And so I believe very strongly that phenomenology, whether you're talking about someone who has depression or someone that has addiction, if you can kind of get into this first-person human experience model, it really allows for understanding the context of human experience and a much more rich tapestry of what it is that the person is dealing with. And it also gets away from the tendency to dehumanize the person that's dealing with what they're dealing with, right? To associate the person with their actions, which oftentimes, if you've been an addict or you have them in your life, there are extreme behaviors that people participate in because they're in a sort of traumatic situation, right? There's lying, there's stealing, there can be aggression. There are certain behaviors that come with that. But if you're inside of that person's experience, and it becomes much more. Their humanity becomes much more accessible. So that kind of brings me, I think, to where I want to leave today, which is kind of where does that leave us, right? If all of those things being said, what does that make available? And for me, this talk is really just becomes the context in which the rest of the work, which is what I love doing, is the transformational work. It's actually the bringing of the work that helps to dissolve, is made accessible by understanding the phenomena of addiction more deeply in terms of what it is. Okay, so we're not going to be talking about cures. Like Gabor said, the cure approach views addiction as the problem. And it's kind of like, I'm the expert and then you are your disease, and our goal is that we're going to cure you, right? There's something wrong. Versus in the healing approach, the approach is actually to dissolve the pain. It's to dissolve the issues, to heal the trauma, so that people don't have to use the substances any longer as an escape from their reality, right? Because you can just love your reality. So in the healing model, the question is not what's wrong with you. In the healing model, the question is what happened, and how do we deal with that? In the healing approach, addiction is not the problem. It's a window into into what the interworkings of what's going on. Addiction is actually a solution that we use, and what we want to do is actually go in and dissolve what's going on, so that you don't need that solution to the problem anymore. The problem is the pain. The problem is not the addiction. Let me see where else I want to go.
So I just wrote a long question in the chat box.
Okay, good.
I don't know if you can see it there, but my question is, as someone who might be a friend, someone who's suffering from addiction, what's the best thing that I could do? It's hard for me to know whether it should be just to sit and listen and not try to enforce your opinion, or would it be more of a motivational approach to give them some energy, or would it be a more forceful approach to want to shake them? Like, what is it from your experience that really works, worked for you and works for others?
Yeah, your opinion and because opinion is always generally going to be lodged in judgment, right? Your opinions are not going to help. Motivation is not going to help. So the best thing that you can do is definitely listen, but also get them in communication with people who have the same kind of lived experience. Healing takes place in community as well, right? That's why if you see things like the reason why, people can say what they want about AA and things like that, but the reason why these things have been so successful is that there's a fellowship, right? Because if you think of addiction as the loss of connection or the absence of connection or the experience of being isolated, what's required is human connection. It's to reconnect. It's to have a tribe of some kind. We are social animals. And one of the things that drives addiction more than anything else is people feel shame. They feel guilt, and then they isolate. And then it becomes a cycle of that thing. And when you're able to be in community, especially in a community of people who also have your same lived experience, then what happens is you can share your experience. And healing only happens in sharing your experience with other people who get your communication. And because ultimately what happens is if I share my experience as an addict, and then someone, whether it's verbally, non-verbally, they communicate that I see you, I hear what you're saying, then they share their experience. Now I start to realize that I'm not alone. There's not something wrong with me. This is actually something that's relatively normal, right? And so, that's where a lot of the healing can take place. So if you have a friend or someone in your life that's dealing with this, the best thing that they can do is get into a community of people that share their experience and that they are comfortable with. When I first started in my journey, I had a really difficult time with the God conversation. And so AA was relatively inaccessible for me at that time because I viewed it as, really sort of God-centered, and they had a very specific, my father's a Methodist minister, right? So I went in it with a particular interpretation of who God is. And so it affected my listening. I couldn't be present in the conversation. And so I had to go away for a while. I shared earlier, my wife is, her family's from India, and I worked with a guru who had a very different approach. But the interesting thing is, I got that approach. I used that approach. I used, meditation very deeply. I did vipassanas. I did things like that. And ultimately, what happened was I came back to the 12-step process with a new kind of listening and a new different appreciation for when they say it's a God of your own understanding, they mean that. That's not a trope. And you can bring in, whatever spiritual understanding that you have of what God is, you bring that into the 12-step process, and it becomes a process of transformation. Because in the 12-step tradition, what you're doing is the first step is surrender, right? Admitting that you can't do this thing alone. There's something that you can't deal with your own willpower. And then, you go through a process of what we're going to be calling next week, right? I'll be talking about this in depth, of getting complete with people in your life, meaning deal with reckoning with the impact of your behavior through your life. And what that does is it allows for freedom. It allows for forgiveness, both from other people and also for yourself. And as you go through that, go through that 12-step process, what happens is a liberation. You stop identifying with all this stuff that you've done in your life, and you stop living inside of this context that you're a worthless human being or you have nothing to add. In the 12-step tradition, they say that you'll be astounded by the spiritual transformation that you have long before the process is finished. So it really is, a path towards self-awareness and spiritual awakening. So that's the number one thing that I would say is find a community. As someone who hasn't dealt with it, definitely listening can help, but telling someone, you should be able to do this, or you can do this, I know that you can, and I believe in you, and that type of thing, it's not gonna help. Mel.
Hello.
Hi.
I just wanted to jump on with some appreciation. It's so rare that I can sit and listen to, I don't know how long you've been talking for, maybe 50 minutes. And I agree with every single word that you've said. How rare is that? And so I love that. We're so aligned in our view of recovery. I'm in midterm recovery myself. For me, without the practice, you mentioned Chris and his loving kindness meta. I didn't hear the talk because of the time zone, but I know Chris, and I've been in retreat with him for much of this year, and I highly recommend working deeper with him. But what I would say is that for me, without having the practice of loving kindness, I wouldn't have come into the rooms of recovery because I didn't care enough about myself. Mm-hmm. And so the first thing I had to do on my recovery journey was befriend myself, start to lose some of that hate and blame and that whirlwind of despair and desolation and self obsession, I guess, that I was in. And so that was the first thing. But it was actually the practice of yoga, and I'm so happy to say this in this community. It was the practice of yoga that helped me with the reconnection piece first. The reconnecting to my body. I brought my kids up as a single mom. I was working in a very corporate, full-time, high-pressure job. I was using every single day. And I went back to yoga a few years ago, and I realized that I was so disconnected from my body. It actually brought tears to my eyes. And that process of starting to come home to my body was the start of my healing. And I actually attribute that to yoga. So yeah, I just wanted to share that because I also, I'm also a 12-step fan for the reasons you've mentioned, and the process and the simplicity of that process. And I'm super excited for next week. But first, mostly, I just wanted to thank you for the offering. Really, really enjoyed the way that you've expressed yourself so beautifully. And thank you to One Tree for the event. Yeah.
Awesome. Beautiful. Thank you so much. And thanks for your perspective. It's really amazing to hear, that there are other people out there that have had the same experience and that have the same perspective. It's amazing. I know when I first did Vipassana, one of the things that I got very deeply was that we're all actually addicted to stimulus, and that we're all in this kind of stimulus response model where we're just constantly reacting to things in life. And so, addiction may be an extreme form of that, but it all comes down to the same thing, right? Our inability to sit quietly in a room. As Pascal would say, all of human suffering is based in man's inability to sit quietly in a room by himself. And so, it all boils down to the same kind of experience. So that's amazing. And I know that there's Nikki Myers has a yoga recovery approach that's really amazing. So yeah, part of what I think is important in what Mel was saying is that there's no one path to this. So many people attribute, think that there's one path, but in reality, it's, whatever brings healing, whatever brings you out of your head and into your body and into your heart is what will help you, along the path.
And was there a pivotal point in your journey, Nathan, that you remember that allowed you to move through your addiction, or was it just a slow journey through the whole thing? Is there anything specific?
It's been a long, slow, winding sort of trying lots of different things. Ultimately, what I realized so I had a breaking moment, and it wasn't a rock. So I had many rock bottom moments, right? If you know anybody that's been an addict, this idea of rock bottom is ridiculous. We all have lots of different bottoms. But I actually had a moment where I was sitting in a cafe in Indonesia, and I had been sober for quite some time, but I wasn't in recovery. I just wasn't using, and I had been taking like personal development seminar after seminar, and I had this idea in my mind that I could, from a place of will, I could fix this thing that was wrong with me using different transformational practices and things like that. And I was sitting in a cafe one time, and I was lying in bed in the morning, okay, and I had this crazy experience. I was like in one of these like in dreaming, not dreaming moments, right? And I had not, prior to that moment, had a very open relationship with, like, let's say God. My wife, she's a sick by tradition, and so she had been kind of working on me in these different ways. And I sat through kirtans, and I went through a lot of different things, and I worked with the gurus who all had different perspectives, and I studied Eastern religion in college. I have a master's degree in philosophy, and a lot of it was from the Eastern perspective. But it wasn't, you can study Eastern philosophy without actually dealing with the spiritual element. And something kind of broke through, and I remember waking up in the morning, and I was saying to God, or whatever that experience is, I don't know why I won't let go, but I'm coming. Like, don't stick with me. Like, I can feel something shifting. It was the conversation that I was having with myself, the God within me, I should say. And for whatever reason, I sat up on the bed, and I turned and I said to my wife, I said, hold on, I just got touched. I said to her, thank you, for dealing with all of this, and I said, I don't know when it's going to come, but I can feel it coming, there's something, my walls are like going down. And I was sitting in a cafe, literally. I was surrounded by people, by the way. And I got this random text message. People send you those pass it on messages or whatever. And it was a passage from some book. It was a book by Rick Warren. And it started off by saying, a man wakes up in the morning, right? He sits up in bed and he turns to his wife, and it was literally like, I felt like I was reading my experience in the morning. And in that moment, what happened was I started having all these flashbacks of the last couple of years of people sending me, me being on YouTube searching for something else, and someone coming up sharing their experience as an alcoholic. And all these things started coming back, and I realized that these messages had been coming to me for quite some time. I just couldn't hear them. And in that moment was the first time where I said to myself, or I received the message that there's nothing wrong with you. And you're gonna be okay. That's what the thing just kept coming. You're gonna be okay. You're gonna be okay. There's nothing wrong. And I burst into tears. Like all these people, I'm like melting down in this public place. My wife comes in the door a couple minutes later. She's like, "What's wrong?" And I was able to say, "There's nothing wrong." Like I'm home. And that was the first time where I felt surrender. You people talk about surrender and acceptance all the time. And from that day forward, my life has never been the same. I don't have resistance around this. I talk about my, everything that I've gone through in my life openly. And that's when my healing started, when I realized that there's nothing to resist. There's nothing to fight against. There's nothing wrong. So that was the one turning point where everything changed for me. And I feel like all the work that I had done up until that point, including Vipassanas and all that, had simply prepared me for that moment when I was willing to just let go.
You're bringing tears to my eyes.
It's not my intention anyway, but this is part of just being human. Okay.
I believe
Changa, you
Dr.
have
Changa. Yeah.
you're muted.
Oh, hi, Nathan. Thanks for sharing. Nathan and I used to speak once a week, right, when we were back in Bali. Uh, so you used to try and drive some sense into me back then. So I think it worked a little bit. I'll tell you offline about all of those. But there's one thing you mentioned earlier on that I really want to reiterate. You're spot on about what happens in Western medicine. If you open let me put my hand down here. If you open any medical textbook, any of you can do it. You can find one online. You can go to a library. Just get the Harrison's textbook of medicine or whatever it is, and you flip it open. You see everything organized into chapters, right? You have the gastrointestinal system, the cardiovascular system, and at the end of each of these chapters is a section on treatment.
Hmm.
This medicine, use this procedure, use. So an entire textbook of medicine is made up of you know chapters with a treatment at the end of each of those chapters. Now, let me tell you, I really believed in this format. As a trainee, as a medical student, as a resident, as a registrar or a fellow. But then, when you apply those in real life, it wasn't working. I mean, think of myself as a pretty smart guy. I knew the science, but the people were just not getting better. And that's when I had to go back and relearn and reassess everything that I had been taught until that point. And then I realized that the simple truth is that the human body and the human mind, you cannot segregate it into different chapters. You just cannot. I mean, the gut is connected to the immune system, which is connected to the nervous system, which is connected to the mind. It's all one being. And you touched on getting those text messages. I mean, we're not one being, we're one being, we're beings within a network, right? And it's about connecting to that network. But the point I wanted to make was about the treatments. And even in behavioral sciences, oh, you're depressed, here's an antidepressant for you, right? I know this session has been recorded, but I'll come out and say it. It all goes back to the curricula that are taught in schools. Who designs curricula? Who has input into what's being taught in medical schools? Could it possibly be connected to the medical, that part of the medical industry that has to do with procedures and pills and pharmacology and so on and so forth? Right. So these are questions that we should all ask ourselves. Our systems are too complex to be simplified into 15 chapters with treatments for each of those. It can't be.
Yeah.
No, I just wanted to tie that into what you were saying about, we'll fix you kind of approach.
Yeah. I got that. Thank you, Dr. Changa. Yeah, and like you were saying, we're one tree, right? We're all whether it's our body is one tree, or we're also hooked into a global ecosystem, So Yeah, it's important. I do think, I do believe that that model, if it's couched within a wider context and you're using an interdisciplinary approach, then somebody who's experiencing, PTSD or something like that, if they need a little bit of, let's say, medication to help them calm down, so that they can get, some treatment and talk therapy, and there's a lot of different plant medicines that are out there these days that are helping people heal a lot of things that have happened in their past. Then there's a place for all of these things, but not in silos. It doesn't work. Like you were saying, we're very complex organisms, and we have to work in conjunction with each other instead of exclusion. Amazing. Dr. Changa, everyone. Tune in on Wednesdays. Is it Wednesdays or Thursdays?
Thursdays.
Thursdays. Tune in on Thursdays.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, my friend. Shanka? Forgive me if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly.
Shanaka.
It's
Shanika.
Shanika. Thanks, Nathan. And thanks, Changa, also for something that I think really needs to be said in much more wider fora. But you might get your head locked off. I've lost a lot of my doctor friends in the recent past as well, in the last maybe 18 months. But anyway, be that as it may. Nathan, just a quick one based on something you said earlier in the lecture or the talk. I've done a lot of work. I'm glad you mentioned plant medicine. I'm not sure whether it's kosher to mention that stuff, but I guess this forum is something that I can mention it in. And I've worked through a lot of stuff. I don't think I could say that I was addicted to a particular thing for very long or very seriously or anything like that. I don't think anybody who knows me would describe me as an addict per se. But going backwards, you realize that, yes, it's not something that is wrong with you. It's something that happened to you that probably was not your intention or that you didn't invite. Like, say, for instance, somebody's walking in a parking lot and gets raped and they have the trauma from that they take forward. Obviously, those are the moments. Some of us haven't happily gone through that kind of obvious trauma, but there's still something there. So when you go back and back and back, Nathan, I found that I'm able to intellectually understand what happened. I've been able to unpack a lot of stuff and be like, oh, right. That's the moment where, this particular lack of affirmation or lack of validation or absence of love or abandonment happened. But how do you move beyond that intellectual understanding? If you're coming to this in the next couple of talks, that's great. Just let me know. But that's something I would really like to understand.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. I mean, that's really where a lot of the work that I do takes off from that question. So next week was going to be basically mainly focused on that. But the short answer is that's why, I call my approach phenomenological and ontological. So ontology is the study of being. This study of the identity or what something is. So we as human beings have an identity, right, which is kind of a conversation or interpretation of who we are, and that is built or accumulated over time based on meanings that we associate with things that have happened to us, and these kind of aggregate into a conversation or interpretation of who we are. And that becomes the kind of the filter through which you understand yourself and also through which you understand the world. And as you can begin to go back into those experiences, okay, intellectually understanding them is one thing, but actually going in and changing the meaning that is associated with those events is what allows for a transformation at the level of your identity. And it also then simultaneously transforms your experience of the world that you live in. And that ultimately is where, the crux of the matter is. So if someone does have something traumatic that happened to them, right? Even that language, like what I just said, it's interesting. So there's what happened, and then there's the trauma is all the meaning and the interpretation and the experience of that event. And part of what you can do is you separate what happened from the meaning that you attach to it, and realize that, if you made it mean, for example, that I'm not worthy or whatever, and you associated that feeling with that event, you actually think that event was an evidence of, that you not being worthy or whatever the case may be. But the more that when you can separate those two things, and you can actually drop the I'm not worthy and give that thing a different meaning, then it can radically alter who you are for yourself, like that. So that is kind of the framework for the work that is done. It's like the you that's underneath of it all is all made up. It's just a story. There is no you underneath of it all, right? It's just something that's been made up. And that can be a little bit confronting for some people, but the upside from that is you can also just recreate who you are, right? You have the ability to change the conversation or the stories that we tell ourselves. I hope that kind of addresses what your question a little bit.
Yeah, I completely get that. The fact that we are kind of a blank canvas, as it were, and there's all this stuff that we've chosen to draw on it, and other people have spilled paint on it, etc. I'm wondering, like, is there a particular practice that we can move to when you understand that, or is it just keep doing what you've been doing?
No, you can't keep doing what did Einstein say, right? Insanity is the continuing to do the same thing that you've been doing and hoping for a different result. A lot of it is they're conversations. So I'll talk more about this next week, but it really is actually going back and resolving the things in your life, generally through communication, dealing with things that you don't want to deal with. It's actually, you have to go take actions. So that's some of the stuff that forgiveness is a big part of it. Because otherwise you get stuck in the intellectual part, and your mind will actually use the intellectual aspect of it to convince it that it's doing the work. It's not doing the work. It's bringing you to the point where the work can be done, and then you have to choose then to take the next step.
Yeah. I think that's kind of where I'm at. I'm just stuck there at the moment. So looking forward to next week.
Awesome. Yeah. Great. We'll take one more with Lolo, and then I think we probably have to wrap up. Jan?
Guys, sorry, I'm in bed here. It's pretty late in Bali. Okay. I just want to say, yeah, I spent so many years. I'm also in recovery, but I'm in recovery from eating disorder stuff. And the behavioral disorders are so much more difficult, I think. It's easy to stop doing drugs and stop drinking alcohol, but food is just so available, and exercise is so easy to do. And it's a really, I spent my whole life with people telling me that I'm broken and I've got a problem and I need to fix it. And I went to rehab, and they tried to force me to, they shoved things down my mouth to force me to eat. And I can understandably, I needed to get some nutrition in my body, but like trying to fix the symptoms, I spent 20 years trying to fix the symptoms. And only in the last maybe 5 years or so, literally exactly what you've just said now is like, I'm not broken. I just have a coping mechanism that is a little bit strange. Mm-hmm. And, it's getting better and better and better. And it's a process that is not going to fix itself overnight. And it's a really, I've helped many, many people along my way just through my own experiences, and I still got a hell of a long way to go as well. But this is the life journey, and it's a forever thing. And, I can't say I'm never going to be able to eat again, because I have to eat to stay alive, right? I so often wish that I was maybe a drug addict or an alcoholic, because then I could say, I'm never going to drink again. I'm never going to do drugs again. But it's like, yeah, I'm going to eat 3 times a day. And it's just a really interesting spin on addiction, but hell, it's an addiction nonetheless.
Oh yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk, and I'm grateful that I'm still awake because usually I'm asleep by 9.
Well, thank you for sharing, and and thank you for just being open about what you're dealing with. Engaging in conversations like this are super helpful. I mentioned Gabor Mate earlier. He's someone that you can go look at. He's very clear that it doesn't matter. I mean, honestly, whether it's food, porn, sex, drugs, alcohol, validation, relationships, if it's a coping mechanism, there's something incomplete, something that has happened that has not been resolved. And a lot of the last gentleman, part of what I think that where the plant medicines can come in and play a really interesting role is that if there are things that are undealt with, and maybe they're not dealt with because you actually have, your mind has physically put them out of your view, they do tend to be able to have the ability to unlock these things so that you can actually face them, deal with them, things like that. So that's where I think a lot of some of the deeper work with things like that, really, it's about resolving our past.
Yeah. We'll keep on going on the journey.
Right. Yeah, one day at a time.
Bye.
Okay. Thank you, Lola, for sharing and staying awake in Bali. I honor you for that. Ayahuasca. Yes. Amazing experience. And we can talk more in the coming weeks about where the place the place for that actually may be. And it looks like what is it, MDMA assisted psychotherapy and psilocybin, it looks like will be scheduled by the FDA within the next year or so. So definitely moving in some positive directions in that area. All right. Well, I think that brings us to our conclusion for this week. Next week we'll be talking about dealing with the past, getting complete about the past so that we can have some freedom to create something for the future. So thank you all for coming. I love you all. Regardless of where you come from or what you're dealing with, you're here today engaged in this conversation. I honor you for that, and thank you for allowing me this space to have this conversation.
Thank you, Nathan. That's really inspiring.
One tree.
Touching. I'm really happy that you can share with everyone on One Tree. So if anyone wants to catch up on this video again, I will be putting it's on Facebook, on our Facebook page, One Tree Community, so you can always revisit it. And I'll be sharing any contacts with Nathan if anyone wants to connect to Nathan in any way. It'll be on our WhatsApp group. So again, thank you, Nathan, for your amazing talk. We will catch you next week.
Awesome.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a great night, morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you may be.